I'd like to turn now to item 9, which is investing in specialised services, and invite Barbara to introduce the thinking. Barbara, please.
Thank you, Chair. This paper does a number of things. It starts by reminding the board of the nature of specialised services, and then goes on to propose some principles and a method by which we can prioritise the introduction of new developments and new interventions. Specialised services is a very, very complex agenda because these are treatments for the most rare disorders. They're often for patients who are extremely ill, and the disorders themselves are often, and the treatments themselves are often complex and expensive. And often we find ourselves in a situation where it's difficult to use the tried and trusted methods of identifying what works really well because of the rarity of the disease and the inability to do large trials. So what we need is a method that we can identify when new treatments and new developments comes along, how NHS England can decide which of those to prioritise, which of those to provide for patients. So if I just start by reminding, the first part of the paper reminds of the extent of specialised commissioning and that this there's a £14 billion budget there. And I probably would want to say that the majority of treatments that NHS England commissions out of the £14 billion budget are tried and tested, and we are absolutely clear that they have considerable impact for patients and that they deliver value for money for the NHS. So what we're looking for now is how do we define a decision-making process which allows us in a kind of open and transparent, timely way to decide when there may be additional things that we need to add to the list of things that we routinely commission. And I would also like to make the point that this is about adding to the list of the things that we routinely commission, or identifying the range of things that we routinely commission. It doesn't preclude the payment for a treatment for an individual patient. So in NHS England we have to make a decision as to those types of care which we say to doctors and clinicians in the front line. This is routine care in NHS England. If you initiate this treatment for a patient, it will be funded, it will be paid for, it will be available. However, there are always exceptions. There are times when it's clear that something isn't necessarily appropriate for a group of people, but for one or two individuals with their specific circumstances. Then it's actually really important that we can look at an individual patient and decide whether in that particular instance this might be ideal for the patient. So just to make very clear, this is about what we would routinely commission. It's not about individual funding requests, which still remains in place, and it's not about the Cancer Drugs Fund, which isn't part of this process. So if we look at the background, we have in place a set of transitional arrangements. NHS England, it's not quite as slightly older than it was, but we still are a relatively new organisation. We inherited a lot of different ways of working from all the PCTs, and we put in place a set of transitional arrangements which we agreed that we would then work with stakeholders, patients and the public, all those who could and should have a voice, to put this on a firmer and more long-term footing. And that's where we find ourselves at the moment. I think that this is particularly apposite at the moment, again, given the conversation we had about allocations and the clarity that the specialised commissioning budget has got a significant increase in it for next year, and therefore our ability to look at new treatments and interventions, it's more important now that increase in funding is available. So over the past few months we've been working with a number of stakeholders in order to bring to the board a set of proposals on which we can then go out to wider consultation. So the things in the paper you see before us haven't been widely consulted on. That's precisely what we're proposing, but we have worked with significant numbers of patients and other stakeholders and patients' representatives in order to get to this point. So what we're proposing to talk to you today about and ask the board for agreement for consultation is the two key elements of the principles of the decision making. So in other words, exactly what at all stages of decision making is the comprehensive set of principles which everyone in NHS England will adhere to through our process. And I think, to be honest, those principles are self-explanatory, so I won't go through those in detail. The second thing that we're wanting to talk about is the characteristics of the process through which we'll make those decisions, and I will talk a little bit more about that. Again, if I can remind the board, although this was mentioned earlier, that there are certain things over which we do not have a choice, whatever our funding allocation is. We have to do what we've called first order interventions, such as nice technology appraisals. There is a second order, in exactly the same way we would with any other budget. We have to deliver the 18-week standards, the cancer standards for patients who have for specialised services in the same way as we expect the CCGs to do so. And therefore this would be an absolute second order call on the allocation for specialised. What we're calling the third order is where we've collectively agreed a clear strategy and the developments clearly fit into the strategy and a direction of travel to which we're all committed, and there are a couple of examples there. And then the fourth order is the considerable range of other specialised service developments that we receive. And I think it is really important to remember that we have duties to many people in NHS England. We have absolute duties to patients to make sure that those treatments which make a difference, which really do work and will improve their life expectancy or the quality of their lives, are there and available for them. But also a duty to the taxpayer and the nation to make sure that every penny we've got is spent wisely and that we make the most difference to the greatest number of patients that we possibly can. And because of the complexity and an exceptional cost that's sometimes involved in specialised commissioning, I think nowhere is it more stark than there are some difficult choices to be made. So what we're proposing in terms of how we do this, which we believe will be a much more structured process than what we've had in the past. If we move on to in section 15. Some quite fancy names in these, but I'll try and explain them a little bit as clearly as I can. The environmental scanning phase is really about our clinical reference groups looking around and identifying all the things that might be coming through. One of the things we need to do about this process is get more onto the front foot and be able to deliver a continuous process, not have a situation where we've got a one-off opportunity for people to make proposals to us once a year. We want to turn this much more into a continuous process. So the clinical reference groups will be looking to identify what is coming through. But I think doing a bit more work on exactly what happens with those individual proposals, because we have found in the past that some proposals have come a long way through the system, and when you look it's clear that they are funded in a routine way through tariff or somewhere else in the system. So that environmental scanning is not only about identifying what's available, but identifying is this treatment or development right to carry on through this process. I think that the next phase is to look, and there will be a plethora, there will be a huge range of things come up through the clinical reference groups. For the national programmes of care, which are more groupings of the clinical reference groups, to start to look at those and give us some sort of order out of them, so some sort of prioritisation as to which ones fit with the broader strategies, which ones it is that we should be really moving on to look at in great detail. The clinical build phase is about the detailed work that makes sure we understand there is a really strong evidence base behind the proposal. So to be absolutely certain that by the time we get to a point where we are making decisions, there is no question about what evidence there is. Now, bearing in mind what I said earlier, that sometimes with rare disorders, evidence is not as readily available as with some, but nonetheless, that is going to be so vitally important. And running almost certainly concurrently with that, understanding the financial, particularly the impact analysis, but all the other things that we do with impact analysis about reducing inequalities, so that we get to a point when the Clinical Priorities Advisory Group is coming together to advise the newly formed Specialised Commissioning Committee on behalf of the board, that it has got every piece of information it needs in order to make its decisions and make recommendations as to what we should do next. Now, all of those phases, there's a lot behind those phases which isn't in this paper. The detail behind those phases will be in the consultation process. And one of the things I think it's important to be clear about is that each of those phases will have a decision-making point in them. So the only decision-making point is not when the final decision is made in the governance, but actually each of those phases will have a decision-making point, and therefore we need to be really clear with patients, the public and all stakeholders where those decision points are and how they can be involved and how they can influence and how they can shape the process so that they're involved in that. So those are the two things that we would propose to consult on. I think that it's worth saying to the board that one dilemma for us is probably the length of this consultation, and it would be really helpful to me if I could have a steer on how long we should consult for. On the one hand, I think there is a strong argument that with something as complex as this and such a big decision for us, that a 90-day consultation, the more traditional 3-month consultation, is more meaningful and really does give patients and the public and all stakeholders the chance to collect and collate and give their views in a meaningful way. The downside to that is that we have been going through this process for some while. We have a number of treatments waiting in the wings ready to be assessed that I think a lot of stakeholders would have a reasonable expectation that we would be assessing in March, and clearly a 90-day consultation with the process then following would probably push those out into some time in the summer. But two things I would say to the board in terms of mitigation against that is, firstly, there is no change to our ability to deal with urgent issues where something comes along where it's clearly going to make a very significant difference to a cohort of patients, and it has to be initiated urgently because of their condition. So we have routine processes for that, and that would continue. Secondly, I would remind about the individual funding requests, which are still there. And thirdly, because of the additional funding going into specialised services, what we would propose to do would be to allocate to the regional teams who will hold the specialised budgets, their full budgets, but make it absolutely clear the volume, the financial allocation that we would expect them to reserve and have in their plans in order to then fund these areas as they go through the process and we make the decisions. So we're not in a situation whereby we make decisions in July and then we have a scenario where people say, oh, but we've made our plans and all the budget is spent. So if we were to go for the 90-day consultation, we'd make sure that the holders of the budget were clear that they had to plan to have that money available. I may mention to the board, if I could, that our own stakeholder group of patients, they've indicated to us that of the two, they would prefer the 90-day consultation, but obviously there's a much broader range of stakeholders as well, all of whom will have views. So if I could, I'm happy to answer any questions as I can on this, and then what I'm asking for really is, do we think the principles are right? Are we happy about the process and the stages that we've described? Is everybody happy that we can launch the board approve and launch the consultation in the new year? Delegate the returns to the Specialised Commissioning Committee, and if you would please a steer on the length of the consultation.
We'll maybe take those points in the order in which Barbara has put them to us. First of all, can I get a steer from the board as to whether they believe that launching this process is the correct thing that we should be doing? Secondly, the principles which are outlined in the paper. Thirdly, the stages of decision-making, the prioritisation criteria. And fourthly, the stages which start with environmental scanning and go right through to the final prioritisation. We are today, after all, only being invited to approve a set of principles which will then go out to consultation, and we'll hear further from that. Let me then turn to the consultation question, Barbara, because I think there's a question to ask, which is, I mean, we have done 30-day consultations in the past, and we know that in some circumstances that works perfectly well. Are you suggesting to us that 90 days is what we're hearing from stakeholders, and given the complexity of this and the variety of stakeholders, would have a greater likelihood of returning a richer set of information for us, but also that you've got the capacity in the interim to continue to manage commissioning for treatments which are urgently required for patient groups? In other words, we're not delaying a whole slew of approvals in order to go through a 90-day consultation.
I think it would be unfair to say that that there will be some delay, because what we've got is the facility to accelerate anything which is urgent. But many of these cases, we've known about them for some while, and they wouldn't meet those criteria, so they would need to go through the full process. And therefore we have to balance the risk that some of those will wait another 2 or 3 months before there's a clear decision, against, as you rightly point out, Chairman, what the richness that we would get back from a consultation. One of the issues, of course, is that with such rare disorders, people are from all over the country, and it's always more difficult to consult with people who have the families and patients of rare disorders, simply because they have more difficulty in having a presence. That's why every individual CCG can't consult on this, because there aren't enough people, isn't there, critical mass. So therefore quite a lot of the really important stakeholders here will need to consult across the country with a variety of people. But we do have, it's only our own patient group, but we have had a letter, I think a letter came to Simon from our specialised services client group, because we have a patient group that helps and advises us, saying that that they would prefer it to be 3 months. I mean, there is no doubt that we very frequently do 30-day consultations, and it would be normal and perfectly appropriate to do a 30-day consultation. It would be a slightly unusual for us to do 90 days on something of this nature, but I think the thoughts about it actually have been precipitated by the patients themselves asking us to do that. But I think it's difficult. It's a difficult decision, because there are pros and cons to each.
Kieran.
I think it's a very easy decision. 30 days to consult an awful lot of people and an awful lot of organisations on something of this magnitude and complexity, it just doesn't work. And I think specialised commissioning has, in the past, produced some major consultations and expected people to drop everything over Christmas and get back in 30 days, please. And it just wouldn't work. So I think it's entirely straightforward, and it's 90 days, and then we live with the consequences.
Margaret?
Nature of specialised commissioning, and as Kieran says, the complexity of the areas with which one's potentially dealing, it strikes me that as a statutory body we have a duty to have regard to everything that's relevant, and we put ourselves in a difficult situation if we have too narrow a period, because we won't engage with the widest possible number of potential stakeholders, and I would, as Kieran would, on the side of the 90 days, in order that we can have regard to as much as we can, so that we aren't in danger of inadvertently disregarding something that we ought really to have had relevant, paid relevant attention to. So I would suggest 90 days, and in particular I feel more confident in that, because we do have the ability to deal with urgent issues. So if anything does suddenly need urgent attention, we can accelerate that, and so it isn't as though we'd be leaving an area in jeopardy by lengthening the period of consultation.
Sam?
I agree. I think on this occasion we should exercise our discretion to have a more extended consultation period than might normally be required, just so that the board is clear on the point, legal advice has been that a 30-day consultation on most topics would normally be perfectly appropriate, but we obviously have discretion, and given the range of considerations that this much broader paper than a particular consultation question, I think we should exercise our discretion.
Under the circumstances, and given the real serious character of these proposals and their complexity, I detect that the board would prefer to go for a 90-day consultation against the assurances that Barbara's been able to give us about our flexibility to respond to urgent cases. So I think that I have agreement around the board to the principles that process the consultation.
Sorry, just before you conclude, we've been thinking about the infrastructure that makes this complex and highly sort of engaging more effective, and I was thinking the NHS citizens process going forward should be part of this, and I am concerned that we have the resources to do so, and I'm a bit worried about the cuts that we made earlier and the impact. So on the one hand, we've got to engage with the communities around complex issues. We've got a framework of a means of doing that, and the first meeting of the project that we had last few days ago, has got some kick-off, has got some really, we're going to get off to a strong start. On the other hand, we may be losing the resource that enables us to do this kind of thing effectively and as a matter of course, which, by the way, will involve quite a significant shift in the skills of our staff in the operations department going forward. And I'm just a bit concerned that we kind of skate over that fact. It's quite a significant culture shift and operational shift without...
Well, maybe I can just say two things on that, Victor. One is that, we have a process between January and March for agreeing our business plan for next year. We have to publish that for 15-16, and that's the process where we have to make these internal resource decisions. So that's a decision we as a board have to hammer through. And then secondly, as part of the 200 million for transformation, we're obviously going to expect that local areas working with us are going to use some of that to resource these kinds of processes as well. So I think we've got to kind of think about both aspects of that. But the underlying point you make is obviously right.
Tim?
Well, just to add, so I think one of the things, going back to planning guidance, we have now signalled that this a very important structural priority around properly prioritising the patient and citizen voice in decisions we make is for real, and against that commissioners must be judged. There's obviously an issue in terms of programme budget allocation, which, as Simon says, we'll deal with. But I think one of the lessons which we need to just recognise is that what we're being taught here about the process of specialised commissioning over the last couple of years is that we have not successfully deeply embedded the patient voice in the decision-making process, and this is an opportunity for us to not only consult on the priorities but also start to think and challenge, as I know you'll do in the Task and Finish group, ourselves around the kind of culture we actually need to start promoting properly as an organisation.
Okay, I hadn't anticipated that this would be a process simply of publishing a paper and sitting back and waiting for responses to come in. I think within the time and the resources that we've got, we need to take on board Victor and Tim's comments and work out how we get a proper engagement, a proper triangulation of views that can bring a richer intelligence to us in the process. Barbara, did you wish to comment?
I absolutely agree on that, but it will need the kind of matrix organisation. The specialised commissioning team is very small and needs to work. We need the support from particularly Tim's department and the directorate and the clinical directors, because that's where the expertise comes from in terms of working with the public.
Right, well, thank you very much. I have one final request of the board on this paper, which is, will you authorise the Chief Executive in consultation with me to sign off the consultation paper?
Can I just make a point on the principles? I think if we're going through this process, a bit of a look at CRGs themselves. Are they constituted correctly? Do they have this process of engaging people who look at things from multiple lenses? There's another question around whether we have the right CRGs. Because one of the risks of being quite specialised is they'll judge things in terms of being specialised, as opposed to actually the really effective intervention is non-specialised and it's prevention or it's public health or something else. So I think if we're going to look at this, let's maybe look at it a bit more broadly there as well, and take the pathway view. And even though it's specialised and it's difficult and it's complicated and small numbers of people, etc., maybe some of the interventions would benefit from people with different expertise, or wider expertise might be a better way of saying it. And if that could be in the loop as well, then I think our 90 days will be, again, more than justified.
Yeah. And that's such a good point, and one that is one of continuing development after the 90 days as we get the new structures into place. Right, can I just check everybody's happy to delegate as proposed, and the future oversight of the process will go to the Specialised Commissioning Committee. What I think we ought to do, though, is bring back a report from the consultation which reflects on how that has worked, what is the richness of opinion that it's delivered to us, and then we will do the further delegation to the Specialised Commissioning Committee. Good, thank you very much. Let me move then to item 10 on the agenda, which is the 3 reports which I propose to take as read. They're starred. Nobody's asked for them to be unstarred, so starred they will remain. And that leads me finally to any other business. First, to report that the date of the next meeting is 29th of January. It will be held here in London. But secondly, just to say the following thing, which is that I think all of us on the board would wish to take this opportunity to commend those who deliver frontline services across the NHS. We've heard a lot about delivery today. I don't think any of us would underestimate the enormous strides the NHS is making all the time to meet sharply rising demand for its services, and to do so at world-class levels of quality and clinical safety, and at world-class levels of low investment. I particularly think it's worthwhile on this occasion commending those who provide excellence, those who provide leadership, both in a clinical setting and management and CCGs, right across the piece, because those are the teams we'll be working with as we come through the next year in the implementation of the forward view. Can I also, on behalf of the non-executive members of the board, express our thanks and congratulations to the executive team. Today has been a very commanding, challenging set of items that we've been asked to consider. And I do know personally just how much time and work has gone into all of this. It brings us back to a question which we will have to continue to keep under review, which is our capacity, our sheer capacity to continue to take a lead across England in the transformation that is proposed in the forward view. And the board is conscious of the burden that we're imposing upon the national directors and the rest of our team. So may I simply conclude by saying thank you to everybody, and wishing everybody a restful, except for those on duty over Christmas and the New Year, but a restful season, and we look forward to picking up the battle again at the beginning of January. Thank you very much. The meeting is closed.